Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Glenn Slater. I've been teaching at Pacifica for a few years. I'm currently the Associate Chair of the Jungian Archetypal Studies Program, and it's my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight Saffron Rossi and Kieran LeGrice, fine people, wonderful colleagues, excellent teachers, and their book, Jung on Astrology. Now, after I just say a few words and introduce the two of them, they're going to come up and talk for about 15 minutes each about their work on the book. And then we'll have a Q&A. And then after that, they'll be signing copies of the book. So, and if you haven't discovered it already, there's wine and other beverages at the back of the room. What strikes me is that Jung always attended to marginal things. He had this incredible interest in what the culture had neglected. So, Gnosticism, alchemy, paranormal experience, and astrology is one of these things. And in a way, it's an obvious topic in this category because it has so consistently been in the cosmological imagination of cultures east and west from the beginning of history almost. The Jung On series, collected under various topical categories such as Jung on active imagination, Jung's nature writings, Jung on alchemy, and it occurred to Saffron at one point that there needed to be a Jung on astrology that collected Jung's writings on this topic. And so Kieran and Saffron got together and worked with the Jung family, got permission from the Jung family, and we have this book. It was recently reviewed in the Mountain Astrologer, which is the premier journal for astrologers in America, and the final paragraph of that review reads, "This is a seminal work. It is exciting to read and of enormous importance for astrologers, Jungian therapists, and countless others in transpersonal and symbolic traditions. Perhaps taken a bit for granted by astrologers and put on a shelf, C.G. Jung has been dusted off by these two brilliant scholars whose deep understanding of their subject will delight the contemporary reader." That's the last part of the review, so you can imagine into the rest. Dr. Saffron Rossi did her undergraduate work at Hampshire College in Massachusetts and then did her doctoral work here at Pacifica in the Mythological Studies program. She started work in the Opus Archive during that process and went on to become the director and for a longer period of time the curator of the Opus Archive. And in that capacity, she got to work with people connected to Joseph Campbell because, of course, Pacifica has housed the Campbell archives. And she also worked very closely with the James Hillman collection, going to the Hillman's house on several occasions, spending several days helping James organize his sizable collection of papers for the archive. And out of that work, Saffron was given the task, which she readily took on, of compiling, editing, and introducing Campbell's goddess lectures. She is also at work right now on a book on the Kore archetype, which is one of those archetypes that Jung studied. There's a whole chapter in, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, but it seems to sort of fall off the radar. She has another ongoing project, which is being married to me. And you might want to ask her how that's going. Dr. Kieran LeGrice, our fearless leader in the Jungian Archetypal Studies program, did his undergraduate work at Leeds University and his doctoral work at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. Kieran has already authored 4 books: The Archetypal Cosmos, Discovering Eros, The Rebirth of the Hero, and Archetypal Reflections, which were taken from his online work with students in this particular program and compiled thematically. He's helped establish the field of archetypal cosmology and is the founder of Archai, a journal for archetypal cosmology. And he still serves as the senior editorial advisor. So, these 2 esteemed people are going to talk to us tonight. We're going to start with Dr. LeGrice, so let's welcome him.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for that very generous and kind introduction. And you kind of set the stage for what I want to say about the book. But let me begin with a few thank yous. First of all, thank you for coming, everyone. And it's good of you to take time out in the evening to attend. And a special thanks to Saffron, my editorial partner on the book. As you heard, Saffron proposed the idea. I think it was not long after I joined Pacifica. And it's one of those ideas where you think, well, why doesn't this book already exist? I mean, it's such a kind of necessary addition, it seemed to us, of Jung's collected writings. So as soon as she said that, I was, it's a great idea. And then it took a little time, but we got around and got onto the project, and we're really pleased to see it come to fruition. So thank you, Saffron, for collaborating so well on that project. A thanks to Susan Rowland, our colleague here in the Jungian program at Pacifica. She connected Saffron and I with Routledge, the publisher. Susan had already published herself with Routledge, so that was our connection, and then it became part of the Jung On series, as Glenn mentioned. And thanks also to Glenn himself, who was kind enough to read and review our co-authored introduction. I was kind of half expecting Glenn to kind of come back with some harsh grade, maybe like a C or something, but luckily enough, he liked what we'd done. So thanks for that, Glenn. Okay, so what I want to do is just to say a little bit about the place of Jung in astrology. Some of you may know this, but Jung's was perhaps the primary influence on the revitalization of astrology in the 20th century. I remember, I got into astrology, it was the late 80s, I think 89. Around about the same time I got into Jung, I was 16, 17 then. And every book on psychological astrology mentioned Jung in some context. And that's indicative of Jung's seminal influence on the field. I think looking back a little further, astrology had this tendency to be literally predictive. So you would pick up an astrology text and have the sense almost that you were reading what your fate was going to be. And it had a kind of rigid, somewhat fatalistic, but certainly a literal predictive quality. And of course, to many of us, that is somewhat challenging, to say the least, because we, as a culture, subscribe to free will, the Cartesian ego that can kind of forge its own destiny. And so to read that your destiny is seemingly set in stone is challenging to the modern psyche. So I think a key element of Jung's influence was to make astrology more psychological and more symbolic, to reveal it as being more symbolic, not literally predictive, but a symbolic system that could help one understand the dynamics of one's psyche. And so that's what you'll see if you read the book, Jung on Astrology, is this symbolic, metaphorical way of reading the configurations of the planets as a kind of portrayal of the archetypal dynamics of the unconscious psyche. So that's kind of where we've arrived at today, courtesy of Jung's contribution to the field. Jung's not always been used in a very sophisticated way in astrology. I think, like many people, astrologers have an intuitive grasp of Jung, or a recognition of what Jung is saying is relevant to understanding astrology. But it's not always been carefully articulated in astrology books just how Jung's ideas are being used. So I think that was one of our motivations. Saffron may speak to that herself, but one of our aims was to try to present Jung's own ideas on astrology so that someone could read the book and say, well, this is what Jung actually said himself, and how has that been translated into psychological astrology. So that's a little background. I mean, we today have access to many books on astrology, and many of them are psychologically oriented. And that is a direct consequence of what Jung did. Astrology in the 20th century began to reinvent itself through theosophy. There was a guy called Alan Leo who was a theosophist, and he pioneered the use of astrology to understand one's own chart, one's own life, one's own personality, which, again, that's something today that we kind of take for granted, that is how one uses astrology. But from Leo and theosophy, then we got to a major figure in astrology called Dane Rudhyar, who's French. He emigrated to the US. And his foundational book is called The Astrology of Personality. That was written in the 1930s. And he, I believe, was the first to explicitly mention Jungian ideas alongside systems theory and Taoism and Hindu thought. So Rudhyar really was the catalyst for transferring Jungian ideas into astrology. And then in the 1970s and 80s were decades where really psychological astrology exploded. And since then we've had the emergence of archetypal astrology, archetypal cosmology, in which I myself have been involved for several years. That's a very rapid kind of survey of astrology. I just want to say a little bit now about the book itself in terms of content. There are 4 main sections. Saffron and I were faced with the challenge of how we're going to organize this, but it did seem, I think, in the end to fall quite naturally into 4 subdivisions. The first one seeks to place Jung's views on astrology in a cultural, historical context. Jung, as Glenn mentioned in his introduction, Jung situates astrology as one of those movements that is in some sense compensatory to the rational bias of the modern West. After the Enlightenment, the championing of reason, the idea that man, as Freud said, is master of his own house, this kind of Cartesian ego, the belief that life can be understood and explained wholly rationally. Well, Jung pointed out that how peculiar then that in this age of rationality we have such interest, widespread interest in Gnosticism, theosophy, astrology, paranormal phenomena, and so forth. So Jung saw astrology, like depth psychology itself, as a compensation for the overly rational, one-sided bias of the modern West. And in another sense, he saw astrology as a compensation for Christianity, a monotheistic Christianity that only recognizes one God. Because in astrology, you have this pluralistic, polytheistic vision of the planets as symbolically representing archetypes or gods. So it's a pluralistic mythic perspective that complements and challenges somewhat the Christian monotheistic vision. So astrology is compensatory in that sense. So that's the first section of the book. Also in there's Jung's own views on astrology. We took some of this from Jung's letters and various other places. But it's interesting to know to what extent Jung himself actually used astrology as an aid in his therapeutic practice. I mean, Jung was doing astrology. He had help, but he was using charts to try to illuminate the dynamics of the psyche when he was encountering a problem that he couldn't immediately see his way through. He would do the birth chart of the person, and that would give him some insight into what was happening here. So that's something that's not really fully appreciated about Jung, the extent to which he actually practiced astrology for 30 years or more. I mean, he began as a letter to Freud in the book 1911, where he said to Freud, my evenings are taken up very largely with astrology. And then there's another letter, I think 1947, to V.B. Raman, Hindu astrologer, where he said, I've been studying astrology for 30 years, and I've been practicing it, I've been using it as an aid to my analytic practice. So it gives you a sense for the centrality of astrology in Jung's worldview and the way he even approached the very practical challenge of therapy. So given that, I mean, you can see the necessity of this kind of book, that there's nothing really in the collected works that conveys Jung's interest in the field. So as we were doing this, I had the fantasy of, could we almost collate this material in a way that it would be a genuine addition to the collected works. I mean, everything is out there, but it's very, very scattered. So I don't know if we were successful, but we wanted to create a book that felt coherent in itself, as if Jung perhaps were contributing to one of his own collected works. That was certainly my fantasy around this. So then the second section of the book looks at Jung's use of astrology as an aid to working with symbolism, so mythopoetic focus, which falls squarely in Saffron's expertise, and she handled that section expertly. The third section, which I think is perhaps the longest, is Jung's writing on the precession of the equinoxes. So if you read Ion, the second part of Collected Works 9, I think, there are, I think, 3 or 4 maybe quite substantial chapters on the precession of the equinoxes, which is a complex phenomena, but I'm sure you've all heard of the age of Aquarius and the age of Pisces, and before that the age of Aries. Jung was interested in studying how, I think particularly Western culture, but global civilization perhaps, moved through these qualitatively different phases that were reflected in its mythic and religious symbolism. And he gets to that through this astronomical phenomena of the precession of the equinoxes. So there's quite a lot on that in the book. And then the fourth section, which I handled, kind of falls in my area of interest, is Jung's quite varying and overlapping explanations of astrology. How can it be that astronomical phenomena have any bearing on human life here on Earth? To the normal way of thinking, it seems incomprehensible. I mean, we can't understand this in terms of some, to my mind at least, we can't understand it in terms of some emitted force from the planet. It's not that Mars moves and we're gravitationally affected by that, and then that has a consequence for our lives. I don't see it in those terms. And by and large, Jung didn't see it in those terms either. So Jung brought in especially his theory of synchronicity to try to help understand just how it is that planets may be connected to archetypes, or why is it that if you're born in late July, August, that you have the qualities of the sign Leo. I mean, Jung saw enough cases of this to be persuaded of the accuracy of astrology, yet he was still, as he was wont to do, he was somewhat skeptical in the way that there wasn't sufficient statistical empirical evidence to support astrology. So he kind of positioned himself as, on the one hand, someone who practiced astrology and who drew inspiration from its symbolism, appreciated its rich history, valued its place in modern civilization as this compensatory phenomenon. But on the other hand, he was quite quick to criticize astrologers and say, look, that they're too literal in their interpretations. There's not enough empirical evidence. This is something that needs to be addressed. And I think it's still largely true today. So that's the fourth section, looks at 7 discrete but also somewhat overlapping explanations of astrology that Jung entertains, from the idea of as above, so below, to the view that astrology is nothing but the projection of the psyche onto the heavens, i.e. that astrologers thought they were actually being influenced by planets, but in truth, in this view, what they were really doing is just kind of projecting the dynamics of the psyche onto the heavens, and the causes were psychological, not cosmological. So that's another view. I mean, I won't go through them all, but a lot of them rest on the idea of synchronicity. And Jung finally, in the 1950s, by this point, he'd engaged in dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, and had released his monograph on synchronicity. By the 1950s, he had arrived at this view of astrology as a kind of, how did he put it, a numinous assemblage of the gods that falls within a numeric, geometric, Pythagorean framework, i.e. that there seems to be something inherent to the nature of the cosmos that conveys archetypal meaning, that somehow the structure of the deep psyche, the archetypal structure of the psyche, is connected to the cosmological structure of things. That he almost got to that insight, and so that's what you'll see when you read through the book. And then we have a fifth section, an appendix, which Saffron did, and this is an examination of Jung's birth chart by his second eldest daughter, Gret Baumann Jung. Published in spring in the 70s, I think, wasn't it? So that's a rapid survey of what's in the book. I think it's pretty revealing. Some of the stuff may be known to you, given that most of you here I have a background in Jungian psychology, but some stuff, I think particularly the stuff in Jung's letters, is some of it's quite surprising. So there are some rich things to mine in the book. Okay, that's all I want to say. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand over to Saffron.
That was amazing, going through all of those sections of the book. So I thought, knowing that Kieran was going to talk about those things and sort of lay out the form of the book and Jung's sort of orientation to astrology and the significance of it in his work, I thought I would sort of go back and share with you sort of the origin story for me, not just before the recognition of the necessity of this volume, which actually has to do with when I was a dissertation student and I was working in the archives. And I think being in this interesting place of transition between completing my dissertation, moving out of the role of student, led to a sort of strange existential period where I wasn't really sure where things were going to go. Where does mythology lead in terms of an academic scholarly life? What was going to unfold? And a kind of, call it like a happy accident, I suppose. My mentor and boss at the time had tickets to see Rick Tarnas give a little workshop at the University Club in Santa Barbara. So it was a very small group of people, and she couldn't go, so I went in her stead. And it was the first time I had heard Tarnas speak, and here he is talking about these planetary energies and their configurations now in the current moment and their relationship to the shifting energies of our experience, personally, collectively. And I realized, listening to him, that the years preceding before graduate school, college, and even before then in high school, all these years of studying myth and being deeply fascinated by symbolism, and then of course the nature of the psyche, the nature of our lived experience, somehow was contained in the astrological perspective, that it was a way in which on a day-to-day basis, let alone on a sort of chapter by chapter movement of our life, these ideas of the presence of the gods and that kind of mythic imagination and its symbolic power lives in close alliance to our life. And that blew my mind. I mean, it was very overwhelming, but it was also, in a way, orienting. It was as if I was connecting to what was really at work in my passion, dedication, and fascination with myth, and why is it so important today? What is it opening us up to when we regard it as a way of exploration and imaginal knowing and reflection? So I think just sharing that little piece was really what brought me to wanting to come all the way down the path to working with Kieran and trying to pull all of Jung's ideas on astrology into a coherent volume, because recognizing that the psyche requires orientation in terms of deep principles. I mean, that's what myth and religion show us. And in our present day, one of the most sensate or ways that that's with us, I think, is in the astrological imagination. So that was really the fire for me. And what I find really interesting is that simultaneous to Kieran and I pulling this volume together over the last couple of years has been the parallel publication of two books that Liz Green had been working on for many, many years. Some of you, maybe most of you, aren't familiar with her, but Liz Green is a British Jungian analyst and incredibly well-known astrologer, Jungian psychological astrologer, perhaps the most famous, most well-known. She had a friendship with Gret Bauman-Jung, as Kieran mentioned, Jung's second eldest daughter, who was an astrologer. She lectured at the Jung Institute on astrology. She often drew the charts that Jung needed of his analysans. So there's a deep history there. But for probably about 10 years, Liz Green has been working on these two volumes, one of which is Jung's Studies in Astrology. So where Kieran and I have put together Jung's writings on it, Liz Green has been given access to his private papers and his library, Gret Bauman-Jung's papers, and has basically traced what Jung read, who he studied. She has copies of all of the charts that he had done. Alan Leo had cast a chart for Jung. as well as a number of other people. The second volume she just published at the same time is on the Red Book, and looking at Jung's Red Book as what she argues to be an astrological hermeneutic. Now, this I find very interesting because I wrote an essay that was published a few years ago in the San Francisco Jung Journal on Saturn in Jung's Liber Primus, the first part of the Red Book. There are images in the Red Book that are explicitly astrological, the Leo lion and the water bearer of Aquarius, and they are painted on a particular page that's very interesting. That led me to explore an astrological interpretation of parts of the Red Book. Liz Green expands this to encompass the entire Red Book, and what she's arguing is that given Jung's deep studies in astrology, which was termed a wretched subject, it's very interesting, the Red Book can be seen as an astrological hermeneutic, meaning that with the active imagination and those practices and Jung's own exploration of these figures and these complexes and experiences, that he was also working explicitly with his astrological chart, that he was personifying his Mars or his Venus in these figures that he accounts and recounts in the Red Book. So it's a fascinating study and something that I'm getting further into. But I share that because I think there's something really amazing about these three works coming out at the same time. As if there's a resurgence or maybe a needed re-attention to the place of astrology in terms of Jungian studies, the study of Jung, let alone Jungian and archetypal studies. How it so often seems to be the kind of thing that we're shy to admit that we're interested in. It's so curious how it still holds that sort of a feeling somehow. So this kind of confluence of interest and energy I find really curious and important. And of course, being that we're with you guys, our students, I love the idea of an astrological hermeneutic, an interpretive layer of phenomenon and experience that draws on astrological knowledge and principles and dynamics. And so Liz Green's work and Kieran and my contribution here, but in our own individual work, I think are helping feed that area of study and research, which I think is very important. So, yeah. I think that kind of covers what I wanted to share tonight. So maybe we'll just do some Q&A.
You had mentioned in the list of other, I suppose, wretched subjects, the Jung's study of alchemy, which was, as I understood that about him, that he had studied that, and that's something that seems celebrated and discussed a lot. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on why his study of astrology has not gotten that same attention or that notoriety that he's gotten with alchemy.
Great question. Thank you. I think first of all it tells us something about the view of astrology in modern culture, that somehow the study of alchemy, changing base metals into gold, ostensibly, is more acceptable than publishing material on astrology. Rick Tarnas once commented that astrology in our culture is the gold standard of superstition, and there's a lot of truth to that. You see even today that scientists take great delight, and the materialistic, positivistic scientists at least take great delight in debunking astrology. So, I mean, I'm not sure that Jung was reticent in writing about astrology, because it came through in multiple ways throughout his published work. But thinking, it took him, I think, 30 years to publish the monograph on synchronicity, because he was aware that that was going to be even more radical than Answer to Job. That's a comment he made. So I think given that context, perhaps there was a hesitance on the part of Jung to take the leap even further and publish something on astrology. He did devote, as I said, 3 chapters of Ion to the precession of the equinoxes, so clearly he wasn't afraid to engage the topic, but I think there's a difference between viewing astrology as a legitimate symbolic system, which is a kind of more acceptable position. There's a difference between that and claiming that astrology is somehow ontologically grounded in the nature of things, which is where Jung gets to in the 1950s, but it's a far stronger claim. And even in the field of astrology, there are some astrologers who want to see astrology as a kind of tool of divination that doesn't necessarily have an ontological basis or a metaphysical basis in the nature of things, but it's just something that we can use almost magically to divine the quality of the moment. And that view is very strong, particularly in British astrology. And there's enough in Jung to support that particular view of astrology. But I myself lean towards that stronger claim that there is a Platonic, Pythagorean, cosmological basis to astrology in the nature of things. So archetypes, as Jung realized, are not just intrapsychic images, but they are principles that somehow inhere in matter too. And that seems to come through in the astrology's recognition of this cosmological order formed by the planets. So I hope that addresses your question. Anything you want to add to that?
I'm going to be provocateur here a little bit. Saffron just presented a whole paper on the connection between astrology and alchemy. Would you like to just share a couple of insights?
Well, when you look at it, Jung says that alchemy is inconceivable without its elder sister astrology. And what he's getting at, and I think that for those of us that not only study astrology but practice it, meaning that it's a part of our own soul practice or spiritual practice, however you call that, begin to recognize that with the consideration of our charts and the figures, the planets, the configurations that they're in, and then the transits that we experience, we are in a process as much as we are experiencing certain principles or presences in that process. And alchemy is all about process. It's all about change. And the two are really wedded, I think, in a very deep level, which is what Jung was getting at. You can't have one without the other. And so I'm interested in not just the historical sense of how astrology has been, and of course when you're looking at alchemical images, astrological glyphs and symbols abound. I mean, that's obvious. But rather that the two arts together show both principles or energetic constants and the ways in which they move and change in life. Yeah.
You triggered one further thought. Astrology and alchemy come together in this idea of hymarmony, which in the medieval view was understood as the binding power of fate, the view that we were under the, well, in the Gnostic view at least, under a malefic influence of planetary gods. And our fate was given to us at birth, revealed in the birth chart, and this had a binding grip on us. And it's indicative of the way that Jung gave a psychological reading both to alchemy and astrology, that he understood hymarmony not in terms of a fated metaphysics, but in terms of psychological archetypal compulsion, that we are under the grip of these archetypes. And as Saffron said there, alchemy is this process by which we can overcome the compulsion of archetypes and therefore win through to greater freedom. And there's one particular alchemist called Michael Mayer who put forward this, this is covered, I think, in Jungian astrology, the idea that one must travel through the planetary houses, as Michael Mayer puts it, and overcome the binding power of each planet, and therefore win through to freedom. And there's this image of Christ. The alchemists were Christian by and large, of Christ conquering the malefic planetary influences and creating this crown with planetary jewels in the crown. And that's a nice image. So yeah, I mean, the connections, as Saffron said, between alchemy and astrology are rich and deep.
Yeah. And just to play off of that too, in Liz Green's Red Book volume, she is drawing out how there are certain figures that are explicitly figures that personify Jung's Mars, and all of the encounters he has with them via active imagination are acts of wrestling with hymarmony, that idea that one has to engage with and sort of work with the deeper nature, not only for one's own consciousness, but for the consciousness of that other, of the psyche that is living through that personified figure. So it's really fascinating how this can be seen coming through his ideas around active imagination and what happens in that process when we're engaging with the psychic other.
Can we pass the mic
over here? Two things. First of all, what you're speaking to is fascinating to me because it's along the lines of what my dissertation is going to be on. So I'm really excited to look at all your work and look up the rest of Liz Green too. So segueing on what you spoke to, Saffron, do either of you know if Jung used actual secondary progress charts or transit charts to see where people were along the individuation journey, or was he just looking at natal charts?
No, the transits and secondary progressions. In the appendix essay in the volume, which was written by Gret Bauman Jung, it's a really fascinating essay, and I was really all about having it available because the only place you can find it is at the Pacifica Library at this point. And Gret makes this statement, which I think is in a way, sort of the linchpin, at least in my fantasy, it's the linchpin of moving astrology into a kind of archetypal perspective, where she says, the archetypes are what we see through. They're how we experience life. You see? So that's a very Hellmanian sensibility, right? That they are modes of perception. They are ways of seeing. And so taking that perspective, she then applies that to her father's birth chart and his reflections in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his experiences, his feelings, his sensibility or attitude towards things, like the way he describes his mother. Well, that's a very Moon in Taurus kind of a way to describe her. So Gret is trying to show how our birth charts are ways by which we apprehend reality, or what reality looks like to us. So there's that. But in that, you'll see that she even talks about his progressions and obviously his transits. So we know that those were modalities of chart analysis that they were using.
Was he using those with his clients or his patients too, about the individuation?
addresses that very issue. Let's see. It's very short. So this is Jung responding to a series of questions in a letter, and he said, I have observed many cases where a well-defined psychological phase or an analogous event was accompanied by a transit, particularly when Saturn and Uranus were affected. So he explicitly mentions transits. Transits, for those of you that don't know, astrology are the moving positions of the planets day by day, month by month, year by year. And you can map those moving positions onto your own chart and understand how the archetypal energies of the universe are coming through you. And just one more point that, again, was triggered by Saffron. I think many of us have this idea that our chart is something that is somewhat other than us. It's kind of imposed on us, which is one way to see it, and there's some truth in that, but there's also the sense that we are living the chart. And so we participate with our own astrological pattern as revealed in the chart, but we participate through the chart itself. It's a kind of reflexive, circular understanding of participation. You can never stand outside the archetypal pattern of your chart any more than you can stand outside of the psyche. You're in it. So that's, I mean, I know that I myself can fall into the trap of thinking, how is Saturn affecting me in these months and years, and kind of easily fail to recognize that I myself, in engaging with life, are expressing that Saturnian archetype. So it's important to keep that in mind. Susan, did you have a...
Yes, it is on. Are you two familiar with the astrological nature of the Narnia books?
I'm not, no.
C.S. Lewis, Narnia, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. There's a lovely book, came out about 10 years ago, called Planet Narnia. And literary scholars have been trying for years to work out what's going on in Narnia. And of course, it turns out it's all astrology. C.S. Lewis was a medieval literature scholar, and each book in the 7 books is of a kind of astrological sphere, as of the kind of medieval astrological sense. So, Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe is Jupiter, hence jovial, and Anyway, it's all really, really precise. And the Planet Narnia book, that's the book that kind of solved the puzzle. And it's a really nice astrology. I was thinking of that because of what you were saying, Saffron, about Liz Green arguing that the Red Book is an astrological work. Because it would be fascinating to look at the Narnia books as astrological works, as a comparative study with the Red Book as an astrological work. And they are, because they're kind of composed in the same era, and to a certain extent responding to the same dynamics. One we call children's fiction, and another we call the Red Book, whatever that is. And just seeing those, that would be a way of looking at the Red Book that would open it up even further. You probably haven't come across the work of Leslie Gardner, but she has the book on Jung and Vico, and she has a lot in that about Saturn, in a way that I think would also kind of feed into this. Yeah. Okay.
If I could just say one thing, we have Becca Tarnas, Rick Tarnas' daughter, is coming to teach at Pacifica in the summer, and she's done work comparing Jung's Red Book with Tolkien's Red Book. So it's probably along similar lines.
I mean, there's a very, very strong and important argument about depth psychology and modernism and the kinds of literary experimentation that was going on at exactly the same time, and in many cases drawing on the same kind of mythical and social kind of energies. So yeah, that sounds fascinating. Who's next?
So my question is around the practical application of astrology and modern psychotherapy. So as in the studying of Jung's works or discussions on astrology, have you come to see it as a viable tool in modern psychotherapy? And if so, how would that be employed?
Yeah. Yes, and yes. Yes. So while astrology, as I had sort of said in my opening thoughts, is this kind of wretched subject that some of us still blush a little when we admit to a stranger that this is something that we do and study, you find in depth psychological clinical practice, many psychologists employ it to work with their clients or their analysands. So it's happening maybe just kind of below the radar with individuals that are open to that kind of symbolic language and exploration. And as Kieran had mentioned, you know, Jung, and it's in the volume, I can't remember the source, but he talks about how in seeing an analysand's chart, it has helped clarify certain complexes or issues that he couldn't quite get at as quickly, just in terms of observation, that the chart then reveals and kind of puts into a deeper context. So there's a lot of coming from Jung, but then also in astrological work, astrological counseling work, the incredible value of this kind of conversation. And, you know, I'm sure Kieran would have his own way of saying this, but, you know, I have a consulting practice. I see individuals for astrological work. And what I find so profoundly moving and healing about the work, both if I'm just doing my own practice as well as with another individual, is that moving out of the personalistic sensibility of my issues, my issue with this problem or this thing that I can't get around, or all this stuff is happening to me and I can't make sense of it. We very easily get caught up in it being either our fault, our problem, or something that we can't get out from under. And I think what astrology does is it opens the imagination. And I don't mean that in a light way. I mean that in a very profound way, that it has us begin to think about the nature of the moment that surrounds us, that we are within and a part of. It opens the question of how are we meeting what's going on in a more meaningful or orienting way, or recognizing the value of something that's going on, even if we can't make sense of it directly right now and kind of solve the problem, but that we can begin to imagine a larger or deeper story that we're implicated in, a cycle that we've been a part of, and all of those things I see as a part of imagining in the sense of the psyche's way of experiencing and storying our life. And I think that's part of what is so healing about astrology, is that it immediately opens us up way bigger than just me. So that's my, my sense of it, and its practical application. So long as the individuals are open to this mode of imagining, it's not necessarily for everyone, but it's okay.
I think Saffron said that very well. Just a couple of thoughts to add to that. Joseph Campbell said that art reveals the grand lines of nature, and I think the same could be said of astrology. And by grand lines, I mean universal themes. So as Saffron said, astrology can raise one's consciousness out of the personal and the particular and enable one to perceive with an archetypal eye, to use Hillman's expression, to see the way that universal themes and universal powers and principles are coming through one's life. And it doesn't necessarily alleviate suffering, but it alerts one to the deeper meaning. And from archetypes you can go to individuation, and then you can come to see what you're going through. If you're going through a period of depression and crisis and struggle, you can begin to see that in terms of its teleological growth-oriented consequence and implication, so you don't get stuck in meaningless suffering, which is a danger, I think. And Jung said, a line I've quoted a lot, meaning makes a great many things bearable, perhaps everything. And astrology, as an adjunct to psychology, allows us to perceive that meaning, and therefore to bear with greater nobility, perhaps, and greater insight, the suffering that we will inevitably go through. So I find that, when I do readings, I find that is one of the takeaways for many people at the end of a reading. They have this more holistic sense of the larger pattern, the cyclical pattern of their lives. They have a sense of the way that these timeless, perennial, universal themes and powers are coming through them. And it can provide a rich source of life meaning in an age when, for many people, we're looking for meaning from somewhere. And so I think it addresses that cultural need for some kind of existential, cosmological orientation in an age between worldviews, between religions and myths, perhaps.
I must preface this by saying I do identify with my astrological sign, but I also believe that sign leads me to be skeptical and seek that statistical evidence that you referred to. That being said, as a tool for understanding and expressing and sharing, as any divination tool could be, from tarot cards to one or another thing to help solve and give meaning to life, solve some questions, I'd feel more comfortable if it wasn't because of the date of my birth, but an archetypal pattern that seemed to fit with me independent of that. Is there any reference to that ideology in Jung's philosophy and writings?
I think what you're describing sounds rather like horary astrology, the divinatory astrology. I think you use the word divination there. And I mentioned earlier the kind of astrology that is the most popular in Britain is this divinatory approach. And I myself can see the benefit of that, and I appreciate it, but it's not my own personal orientation. But there's an idea in Jung that Jung did this astrology experiment, and it's most notable because it was very flawed. So Jung, to state this very briefly, looked at the charts of married couples, and he was looking for, does the husband's sun align with the wife's moon? So he looked at sun, moon, 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 sun, 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 ascendant, about 5 different sets of planetary configurations. So he did this research, and he compared married pairs to unmarried pairs with a hope of perhaps discovering whether there was any statistical significance in astrology, as demonstrated by that particular research. And when he did the calculations, he found that yes, indeed, astrology is statistically significant, at least in this experiment. But then, before it got published, he realized that there'd been errors in calculation. And most of us would be maybe embarrassed by that and kind of quickly retract the research. Jung took that susceptibility to error as an instance of synchronicity. He said that it's because of my and the other researchers' emotional investment in the research, we wanted to prove astrology is valid. therefore, there was a kind of psychic entanglement between the study and the researcher's psyche. Now, some astrologers have applied this principle to understand astrology itself, that in the reading, in a chart reading, there's this emotionally charged field. It's an archetypal moment, right? And that creates a sufficient emotional charge, a lowering of the threshold of consciousness, as Jung might say, that makes possible a synchronicity. And so the reading then is nothing but, I shouldn't say it that way, is a revelation of, through synchronicity, of the meaning of the moment. But it doesn't necessarily, in this view, have an objective Pythagorean, Platonic, cosmological order behind it. So it's a much looser reading of Jung. And Jung, on the one hand, explored this dimension of synchronicity. But on the other hand, he said, look, something more than this is needed. This kind of synchronicity in itself is not sufficient. And so this is getting complicated, but he put forward the idea of synchronicity as a general acausal orderedness, so that it's not just a random or somewhat random sporadic manifestation, but there's some kind of enduring order in the nature of things, a transcendental order in the nature of things, which lies behind particular instances of synchronicity. So again, you've got a kind of a weak form, a weaker claim, synchronicity is divination, and then a stronger claim that there's some kind of deeper basis in the nature of things behind astrology. And you can see it in both terms. Now, I'm not going to say too much more on this, but it's possible, some astrologers would say, well, you can give a very good chart reading even if you've got the wrong birth data, right? And I think this is what you were asking. So you could give a rich chart reading based on the wrong birth data. So, you got the date wrong, you punched it in wrong when you're calculating the chart, and it can still be archetypally rich, and it can still be relevant because, in this view, synchronicity is guiding the whole chart reading experience. You see? And, and I don't doubt that happens. There are synchronistic elements in every reading. What does the client present? What's coming up in the moment. There's certainly the synchronistic element. But to my mind, I spent far too many years studying astrology, and I feel that there's something deeper there. There's something deeper in the nature of things, something like as I said, a Pythagorean, Platonic basis, which Jung gets to later in his life, 1950s. He's moving squarely in that direction.
So let's have one more question. Is there one more question? It's 3 more questions. Okay.
We can try and squeeze them in.
Okay. All right. Let's move through. I think this person, and then Sam, and then did you have a question, Juliet? Okay. All right.
Mine's a quick one too. Do you perceive the chart to be alive?
Well, yes, in the sense that it's an image of the psyche. It's a symbolic expression of the psyche. So yes.
I wouldn't say that, but my dissertation long ago was on astrology and astrological worldview, and Rick Tarnas asked me whether, I can't think quite how he put it, but it was something like, do I see the actual experience of the sun and the heavens as meaningful, or is it just a revelation of something that's psychological? And I said, no, for me, it's the whole thing. It's the psyche, cosmos, unity. It's like unus mundus, so it's a single reality, a single living reality. So for me, it's not that it's just psychological. You can get the sense reading psychological astrology books that we're just dealing with an inner world. But for me, astrology is a means to an appreciation of a re-enchanted world where the whole universe is conveying archetypal psychological meaning. So that would be my...
Yeah, and many psychological astrologers understand the chart as being, as Kieran had described earlier, it is both who we are, the way in which we're experiencing life, and also the potential. So, you know, it's something more than just that. It's being lived into, as well as that which is being lived, right? And so in that sense, I think of it as alive too. Yeah. Juliet?
I'm feeling that aliveness with your talk. This is wonderful. I'm so inspired, buzzing with this. But my question was, I think you mentioned that Jung had a Hindu, you used the word Hindu, also do his chart. And I was curious when you spoke about the his hermeneutic, process with relating with his own charts and everything else, how the differences between the Western model and the Vedic model may have interacted in that wheel of his own relationship.
Yeah, I might have, I don't think I said quite that. I mentioned V.B. Raman, I think that's the name. So he exchanged letters with a Hindu astrologer, Vedic astrologer.
Okay.
But there's virtually nothing on anything other than Western astrology in Jung's writings on the topic. So I don't know, I mean, it will be a fascinating area to explore, how the two different systems represent the same phenomenon, but Jung didn't go there.
Yeah, thank you. How, if at all, does the further exploration of astronomy, as you guys see it, how is that going to affect, if at all, astrology?
I can start.
Sure, yeah.
I think that's a great question, because obviously the focus on the solar system, which by and large is what astrology is concerned with, seems somewhat parochial in the context of the vastness of the universe that we now know. But a key thing to keep in mind when one is considering astrology is that it's centered on us, our perspective in relation to the universe. So, you read that astrology is person-centered. And the ancient idea, of course, was that we were in a geocentric cosmology with the Earth at the center of things. And then Copernicus came along and that shifted into heliocentric cosmology. So it's not that the astronomical reality is geocentric, of course, but astrology is this symbolic viewpoint that's based on the existential orientation of the individual to the larger universe. And in that sense, our immediate cosmological neighbor, as it were, or our outlook on the universe is through the solar system. And just in terms of the very practical issue of how does one use astronomical phenomena to map one's life? I mean, if you go out even further than Pluto, the planets move so slowly in their orbits. They take so long to go around the sun. Like Sedna, I think Sedna is one of the trans-Neptunian dwarf planets, takes 32,000 years to orbit the sun. So you can't possibly use that to make any sense of an individual life, of course. So really, astrology is only concerned with, for the most part, up through Pluto, and Pluto's orbit is over 200 years. So there's that very practical consideration of what is meaningfully relevant to the human lifespan. And then there's the important point that astrology is based on this symbolic, person-centered, existential orientation to the universe. And the solar system is our means to engage that larger universe. So I don't know if, to get back to your question, how new astronomical discoveries will impact astrology because it is concerned more locally with the solar system.
And I think to kind of end on a little bit of an edgy note, I've been working on a talk I'm going to be giving in Chicago later this month, looking at how Hillman's revisioning psychology and the sort of modalities of imagination that he describes, the 4 chapters, are alive in astrological practice. So I've been working on this, and one of the things that he says when he's talking about the Renaissance and a return to the Renaissance and the importance of Marsilio Ficino, who was an astrologer, he says there's a whole list of things about the Renaissance astrologers and astronomers and scholars, sort of attitudes that they seemed to kind of bear in the world around them. And one of them was a disinterest in current scientific fads and ideas that were more concrete or materialistic. And I think I really resonate with that, not out of some small-minded view about the nature of reality and material reality, but rather an interest in privileging the imaginal faculty, the imaginal capacity, the soul's need for non-literal, very symbolic, wild, strange, ancient ideas, and that we are still fed by that. We, as conscious people, but the soul as well. So I always watch what NASA's doing, because it's amazing. But at the same time, I think part of how I understand astrology is that it really connects us to the wisdom of the older primary peoples and traditions and wisdom bodies. And I think that doesn't need scientific proof or more matter to keep us really connected to. So.
One final thought. Saffron keeps triggering further thoughts each time she gives an answer. There's the idea that however vast the universe, and clearly it's immensely vast and perhaps infinitely large, what comes through in astrology is the idea that the universe is meaningfully centered on each of us. And I think that's key because it addresses the problematic element of cosmological disorientation that we suffer from today as a civilization, the modern West especially, that there's nothing firm to hold on to, and we feel like we're adrift in this cosmic vastness. And astrology gives us some kind of way to tune into this underlying order that's reflected cosmologically, that reveals that the universe is meaningfully centered on each of us. And I think that's a great gift.
Let's thank our authors.